It was the summer of 2015 when I decided to spend a weekend camping in the remote woods of Colorado. I had always loved the solitude and peace of being out in nature. It felt like the perfect way to disconnect from the noise of the city and recharge. My dog, Scout, a lively German Shepherd, was my constant companion on these trips. He was the best company I could ask for, loyal, protective, and always eager for an adventure. This trip was meant to be a simple escape. I picked a lesser-known park that was managed by a single ranger station miles away from the main trails. It was isolated, but I liked that. I packed my gear, double-checked my supplies, and drove out early that Friday morning. By the time Scout and I arrived at the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. The trail wound deep into the woods, with tall pines towering above and the faint sound of a nearby stream trickling through the silence. It was perfect. I decided to hike about 3 miles in before setting up camp. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which reassured me that we'd have the place to ourselves. As we hiked, Scout stayed close by my side, his ears perked and his tail wagging happily. We passed the ranger's cabin about a mile into the trail. It looked abandoned, boards covering the windows, and the door was slightly ajar. I figured it was an old structure that hadn't been used in years. By the time we reached a clearing by the stream, the sun was setting. The orange glow of twilight made the forest look almost magical. I set up my tent and got a fire going while Scout explored the area. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you feel small but content. After dinner, I settled into my chair, staring at the fire while Scout lay at my feet. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the occasional rustle of leaves. But as the night wore on, that comforting quiet started to feel heavy. Scout's ears twitched, and he lifted his head, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. At first, I thought he was just reacting to the usual sounds of the forest, maybe a squirrel or some other small animal. But then he growled, low and deep, a sound I rarely heard from him. I shone my flashlight in the direction he was looking but saw nothing. Still, his growling continued, his body tense and his eyes fixed on the trees. It made me uneasy. Scout was well trained, and he didn't react like this unless there was a good reason. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of unease. But as the hours passed, Scout stayed on edge, his ears constantly swiveling and his gaze darting around. I decided to call it a night, figuring we'd both feel better in the safety of the tent. Once inside, Scout refused to relax. He positioned himself at the tent's entrance, his nose pressed against the mesh and his body rigid. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of movement outside. It wasn't the light, rustling kind of noise you'd expect from a small animal. This was heavier, deliberate. My heart pounded as I reached for the flashlight, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Scout was already up, growling again, his teeth bared. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, shining the flashlight around. For a moment, there was nothing, and then I saw him, a man standing just at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring. My throat went dry, and I froze, unsure of what to do. He was too far away for me to make out any details, but something about the way he stood, rigid, unnatural, sent a chill down my spine. I quickly zipped the tent back up and grabbed my bear spray, my only real line of defense. I tried to convince myself that maybe he was another camper who had gotten lost or someone from the ranger station checking the area. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The rest of the night was a blur of sleepless hours, Scout and I both on high alert. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I was ready to leave. As soon as it was bright enough to see, I packed up camp and started heading back toward the trailhead. Scout stayed close, his usual playful energy replaced with a tense focus. About a mile into the hike back, we came across something that stopped me in my tracks. On the trail ahead, there were fresh footprints, large booted prints that hadn't been there the day before. They matched the direction we were heading, which meant whoever made them was either ahead of us or had doubled back. I felt my stomach drop. I kept moving, my eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The trail felt different now, oppressive. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow darker. When we reached the abandoned ranger cabin, I noticed something that hadn't registered the first time. The door, which had been ajar before, was now wide open, and inside, the faint outline of something or someone was visible. I didn't stop to investigate. I picked up the pace, practically jogging the rest of the way back to the parking lot. When we finally broke through the trees and saw my car, I felt a wave of relief. But as I loaded Scout into the back seat and turned to look at the trailhead one last time, I saw him again. The same man standing just at the edge of the woods watching us. I didn't wait. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and drove off as fast as I could. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following us. For weeks after that trip, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stopped camping for a while, unable to enjoy the solitude that had once brought me so much peace. Even now, years later, I can't stop wondering who that man was and what he wanted. There was no logical reason for him to be out there, no explanation for the way he watched us. What scares me most is the thought that he wasn't just some random stranger passing through. He knew we were there. He had been watching us the whole time. It was a decision we had been toying with for weeks, escaping the buzz of our everyday lives for a quiet camping trip. My wife, Emily, and I weren't seasoned campers, but we weren't entirely new to it either. We'd done this a few times before, always sticking to state parks or popular campgrounds. This time, though, we wanted something a bit more secluded, something off the beaten path. We found a spot online, a small clearing near a lake deep in the woods of Oregon, far away from the usual crowds. It seemed perfect. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. The weather forecast had mentioned rain, but nothing too serious. It was late October 2021, and we figured we could handle a little drizzle. We packed our gear, a sturdy tent, sleeping bags, a portable stove, and enough food to last 3 days. I made sure to include a first aid kit, flashlights, and an emergency whistle just in case. Emily joked that I was overprepared, but I liked knowing we'd be ready for anything. At least that's what I thought. The drive to the campsite took longer than expected. The dirt road leading to the clearing was narrow and uneven, with sharp turns that made my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Emily sat beside me, gazing out the window as the trees seemed to close in around us. The further we went, the quieter it got. No cars, no houses, just the sound of the tires crunching gravel and the occasional caw of a distant bird. When we finally reached the clearing, it was already late afternoon. The spot was beautiful, though. The lake stretched out before us, its surface reflecting the overcast sky. The tree line on the far side of the water was dense, a wall of green and brown that seemed to go on forever. We set up the tent quickly, racing against the fading light. By the time we were done, the first drops of rain began to fall. We huddled under the tarp I had set up earlier, cooking dinner on the small stove. The sound of the rain tapping against the tarp was oddly soothing. Emily and I talked about everything and nothing, enjoying the quiet that came with being away from civilization. After eating, we cleaned up and settled into the tent for the night. The rain had picked up, drumming steadily against the fabric above us. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how the rain seemed to drown out the world. Sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The rain was still coming down hard, and the tent was dark except for the faint glow of my watch. It was 2:13 a.m. I lay there for a moment, listening. The rain, the wind in the trees, everything sounded normal. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving outside the tent. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I reached over and nudged Emily, but she was still sound asleep. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make my skin prickle. I grabbed the flashlight from beside me and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness. The tent's walls cast shifting shadows, but I couldn't see anything outside through the fabric. I debated whether to go out and check. Part of me wanted to stay put, to wait and see if whatever it was would go away. But another part of me, the part that didn't like the idea of being vulnerable, decided to investigate. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make too much noise, and stepped out into the rain. The flashlight beam cut through the downpour, illuminating the clearing. Everything looked as it should. Our car parked a few feet away, the lake rippling under the rain, the trees swaying in the wind. I stood there for a moment, scanning the area. Then I saw it, a faint outline near the tree line, something or someone standing still. My heart jumped into my throat. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely human-shaped. I froze, not sure what to do. Whoever it was didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, barely visible through the rain. I felt exposed, like a spotlight was on me even though I was the one holding the flashlight. Slowly, I backed toward the tent, keeping the beam trained on the figure. As I did, it turned and walked into the trees, disappearing from view. I waited, straining my ears for any sound over the rain, but there was nothing. Back in the tent, I locked the zipper and sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, in the rain? It didn't make sense. Emily stirred beside me, but I didn't wake her. I didn't want to scare her unless I had to. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I didn't sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. Every gust of wind or branch snapping in the distance set my nerves on edge. When morning finally came, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Emily woke up cheerful, oblivious to what had happened. I debated whether to tell her, but decided against it. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe my tired brain had played tricks on me. We spent the day hiking around the lake, exploring the area. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet and muddy. Emily seemed to enjoy herself, snapping pictures and pointing out little details like moss-covered rocks and interestingly shaped trees. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching us. That night, it started raining again. We stayed in the tent, playing cards by the light of a lantern. Emily laughed at how bad I was at the game, and for a while I managed to forget about the figure from the night before. But as the hours passed and we settled in to sleep, the uneasy feeling returned. I woke up again in the middle of the night, this time to a different sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the side of the tent. My blood ran cold. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't rain. It was something or someone outside. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling. Slowly, I clicked it on and pointed it toward the source of the sound. The light illuminated the fabric of the tent, but nothing else. The tapping stopped. I waited, listening, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake Emily. Then, from outside, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. I wanted to call out, to scare whoever it was away, but my throat felt like it was glued shut. Instead, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, and the flashlight beam cut through the dark. The clearing was empty. The car was still there. The lake was still there, but no one else. I did a slow 360, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. But as I turned back toward the tent, I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones. Leading from the tree line to our tent and then back again. They weren't mine and they weren't Emily's. They were too large, too deep. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I sat by the tent's entrance, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I told Emily we needed to leave. I didn't explain why, just said I had a bad feeling. She didn't argue, sensing my urgency. We packed up and left, driving back down the narrow dirt road in silence. As we merged onto the highway, I finally told her what had happened. She listened quietly, her face pale. Neither of us said much for the rest of the drive. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with us. I don't know if they meant us harm or if they were just curious. But I do know one thing. I'm never camping in the middle of nowhere again. It was the beginning of September when I decided to take my vlog on the road. I'd spent months planning this trip, heading out into the middle of nowhere to camp, film, and share a real adventure with my audience. The idea was simple. Head to a remote area, spend a few days camping, and capture the raw experience. No distractions from civilization, just me, my camera, and the wild. I had chosen a small, lesser-known area in the eastern part of Oregon, a place most people wouldn't even know to look for. I was in my late 20s, still figuring out life, but this trip seemed like the perfect way to document an experience that would be both challenging and rewarding. I had my usual setup, a small SUV packed with camping gear, a DSLR camera, drone, portable stove, and the essentials like a first aid kit, some extra food, and water. The drive was long, about 4 hours from Portland, and after about an hour or two on the road, the landscape around me started to change. The trees thinned, and the landscape opened up to vast, empty plains, nothing but dry grass, some scattered rocks, and the occasional ranch far off in the distance. It was the kind of place where cell service disappeared entirely, and if anything went wrong, it was up to you to figure it out. After a while, I found the turnoff, a narrow dirt road leading deep into the woods. I'd done some research beforehand, looking at satellite images, but it all looked different in person. The trees closed in, and the air grew thicker with the smell of pine. I was still far from my planned camping spot, but the isolation already felt heavy. The silence in this area was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. No birds, no wind, just the hum of my car's engine cutting through the air. I parked my SUV in a small clearing and got out to stretch my legs. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and I needed to set up camp before it got dark. As I unloaded my gear and started assembling my tent, I noticed the only sound was the crunch of dirt and the occasional rustle of leaves. I figured that maybe I'd just arrived at the tail end of summer, and wildlife had started to move deeper into the forest to prepare for the coming cold. The campground I had chosen was surrounded by tall pines, their dense canopies blocking much of the fading light. It looked perfect for what I had planned. Peaceful, quiet, and isolated. I set up my tent and laid out a small fire pit. As I got my gear sorted, I set up the camera to get some shots of the area. The vlogging part of the trip was the most important. I wasn't expecting anything strange or out of the ordinary to happen. Just me, my camera, and the wilderness. By the time the sun had nearly disappeared, I started a small fire to cook my dinner. The fire crackled and popped, casting eerie shadows among the trees. It was a comforting sound at first, but there was something about the way the light moved that made me uneasy. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the surroundings, but the feeling lingered. I recorded a quick update for my vlog, telling my viewers how everything was going so far, how peaceful the area was, and how I felt disconnected from the outside world. After I finished, I set the camera down and sat back by the fire. That's when I noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was just the flickering light playing tricks on my eyes. But as I looked toward the tree line, I could have sworn I saw something moving. It was just beyond the reach of the firelight, and the shadows from the trees made it hard to make out exactly what it was. For a moment, I thought it might be an animal, a deer, maybe, or some other nocturnal creature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't quite right. The movement stopped as soon as I focused on it. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but whatever it was, it stayed still. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was probably just my imagination running wild after a long day of driving and setting up camp. But as I settled back by the fire, the unease started to grow. I felt like I was being watched. After a quick dinner, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. It was getting late, and I planned to wake up early the next morning for some hiking. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise, every crack of a branch, every gust of wind against the tent felt amplified. I lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the night sounds of the forest around me. And then it happened again. The unmistakable sound of something moving in the woods, just outside my tent. I held my breath, listening intently. It was too deliberate to be an animal. Something was moving purposefully, circling around my camp. I reached for my camera, grabbed the flashlight, and unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The light flickered for a moment, casting brief shadows on the forest floor. I scanned the area with the beam, but saw nothing. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, making it harder to hear any movement. But that sinking feeling in my stomach told me something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, straining to listen to every creak and crack around me. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I quickly packed up my tent and headed out on a hike, desperate to distract myself and focus on something normal. The forest was peaceful in the daylight, and the sun pierced through the trees in golden beams. But the strange feeling lingered. I spent a few hours exploring the trails, recording footage along the way. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I was being followed. A few times, I heard branches snap behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Could have been an animal, but the timing felt too precise, too calculated. At some point during my hike, I stumbled upon something odd. Half buried in the dirt was an old, rusted can, but it wasn't just any can. It looked like something that had been there for decades. The edges were jagged, and the once readable label was completely faded. I dug around it a little, just out of curiosity, but it wasn't the can that bothered me. It was the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, like I'd discovered something I wasn't meant to. I turned around and started heading back to camp. The entire hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. As I neared my campsite, I noticed something even stranger. The fire pit was disturbed. The rocks surrounding it were scattered, and it looked like someone had been through my things. My gear was still there, but it felt wrong, like someone had gone through my food supplies, moved things around, maybe even searched my camera bag. I was on edge, now fully aware that I wasn't alone in this part of the woods. Maybe it was another camper, or maybe someone from a nearby town, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I packed up my things quickly, and as I was loading everything into my SUV, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the dry leaves behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, but the area was empty. I didn't wait to figure out if it was an animal or something else. I jumped into my car, slammed the door, and drove off faster than I've ever driven before. The forest was still behind me, and I couldn't shake the thought that something had been following me the entire time. As I drove back down the dirt road and eventually reached the main highway, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The further I got from that forest, the lighter I felt. I checked the footage on my camera later, trying to make sense of everything. There were no clear answers, just the strange feeling that something wasn't right in that area. It wasn't the peaceful, remote camping trip I'd envisioned. There was something about that place, something hidden beneath the surface, something unsettling. And as I looked out the window, I couldn't help but wonder how much of that forest was still watching, waiting for the next person who might stumble across its secrets. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't want to know. Some things are better left undisturbed. I had always admired my cousin, Jake. He was a cop, a seasoned detective in his 30s, sharp and meticulous, but still full of that raw energy that made him relentless in his pursuit of criminals. I wasn't a cop, but my work as a mechanic put me in contact with a lot of people, and I had picked up a few useful skills along the way. It was early summer when he invited me on a camping trip out in the middle of nowhere, far off the beaten path. The plan was simple: get away from the world for a few days, clear our heads, and enjoy nature. But Jake had other motives. We drove through winding back roads, far away from the nearest town, until we reached a small, secluded patch of forest near the edge of a large, sprawling lake. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and fresh dirt, the kind of earthy smell that would have been relaxing if it weren't for the dark undercurrent I felt as soon as we parked. "We're camping here for the night," Jake said, his eyes scanning the area like he was looking for something. I didn't think much of it. At the time, I thought maybe he was just being cautious, given the nature of his job. He set up the tent, his movements precise, almost robotic. He wasn't chatting much, not like we usually did when we hung out. It was almost like he was waiting for something, or someone. I asked, "You sure this is the right spot?" Jake didn't answer right away. He just nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as he checked his gear. After a few moments, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through something before putting it back in his pocket. That's when I started to realize there was more going on here than just a camping trip. But before I could press him on it, the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. We settled in for the night, and the sounds of the forest around us grew louder. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crack of twigs breaking underfoot. Jake stayed on alert the whole time. He barely touched his food, instead scanning the dark woods, his hand always near the sidearm holstered at his waist. My stomach tightened. I had a growing sense that something wasn't right, but I couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until the sound of an engine cut through the silence that I knew for sure. The sound came from deep in the forest, far off in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. It wasn't a truck or a car. Something about the engine sounded wrong, like it was too old or too heavy for the terrain. Jake's face hardened. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. Without saying a word, he grabbed his flashlight and his gun, motioning for me to stay low. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I wasn't about to ask questions. We moved quietly into the trees, keeping to the shadows as we crept closer to the sound. The engine noise grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just one vehicle, it was a whole convoy. Something was happening in these woods, something illegal, something that could land both of us in a world of trouble if we weren't careful. We found a small rise in the land, just enough for us to get a view without being seen. Through the trees, I saw them, a group of men, at least 6 or 7, standing around a large, beat-up van. They were unloading something from the back, something heavy. There was a smaller truck nearby with a tarp covering a load, but the men seemed more interested in the van. They moved quickly, not talking to each other, just shifting things into the woods. It looked like they were trying to hide something, Jake gestured for me to stay down. I could see the anger in his eyes now, but also something else, fear, maybe. He knew who these guys were. I could tell. This wasn't just some random group of criminals. It was a well-organized operation, and Jake had been hunting them for months. They were known for moving illegal goods, drugs, weapons, whatever they could sell, and they weren't afraid to get violent if anyone got in their way. I watched as Jake scanned the group, looking for a way to take them down quietly. But there were too many of them, and they were too well armed. We needed to think this through carefully, especially since I was with him. Just a mechanic, no training, no backup. We stayed low and waited. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The convoy started to move again. The men climbed into their vehicles and slowly began driving deeper into the woods, cutting across narrow trails that barely looked wide enough for a dirt bike. Jake waited a beat, then motioned for me to follow him. We moved cautiously, staying low, trying to keep our distance. But the whole situation felt wrong, like we were too far from civilization, too deep in the forest to be safe. There was no cell service out here. If something went wrong, we'd be on our own. The convoy came to a stop near an old, rundown shack. Nothing more than a pile of rotting wood. Really, but it looked like the perfect place to stash whatever they were moving. The men piled out, their weapons ready, moving with the precision of people who had done this countless times before. They spread out, covering all angles, watching for any sign of trouble. Jake looked at me, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay here." I nodded. I wasn't about to argue, but I felt the fear creep in. This was real, and it was getting dangerous fast. Jake crept toward the shack, staying hidden behind trees and rocks, his body moving with the skill of someone who had spent years in situations like this. I couldn't see what was happening from my vantage point, but I could hear it. The low hum of voices, the rustling of movement, then the sharp crack of a branch breaking underfoot. My heart skipped a beat. I watched as the men's heads snapped around, their eyes scanning the area. Jake must have made a noise, just a small slip-up. That's all it took. It was like the forest itself held its breath, waiting. The next few moments happened in a blur. The men started running toward the trees, shouting at each other. I saw the flash of a gun in the dim light. I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed a nearby rock and hurled it in the opposite direction, hoping to draw their attention. For a split second, it worked. They scattered, and in that moment I saw Jake. He was moving fast, staying low, but he was close enough to make his move. I could hear the sound of a struggle, grunts, a muffled yell. Jake had taken down one of them, but the others weren't far behind. I ran toward him, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached Jake, who was on top of one of the men, wrestling for control of his gun. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed a branch, sharp and jagged, and thrust it forward, catching one of the men in the shoulder. He cried out, but it didn't stop him. He swung around, knocking me back. My head hit the ground with a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the cold ground. My head ached, my vision was blurry, but I could see Jake standing over me, his gun aimed at the last man. The fight had ended. I didn't realize how close we had come to being discovered. It was pure luck that we managed to overpower them. Jake had taken down two of them, and I had gotten the drop on the last one. Jake pulled me up, his hands shaking. "We need to go. Now." I nodded, barely able to stand. We left the area quickly, taking the van as our escape. The entire forest felt alive with the tension we left behind. But we didn't stop until we were far enough away that I could finally breathe again. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, I glanced at Jake. The world felt different now. We weren't just two cousins on a camping trip anymore. We were survivors of something that should have ended much worse. We made it out, and I had a feeling that it wouldn't be the last time we'd be back in those woods. It was the summer of 2010 when I decided to spend a week at my grandma's farm in the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma. I was 19 at the time, eager for a break from college and the noise of the city. Grandma's farm, with its endless fields and quiet evenings, had always been a place I associated with peace. It wasn't fancy, just a small house, a couple of barns, and a chicken coop, but it felt like a different world. When I told Grandma I wanted to camp out on the property for a few nights, she seemed hesitant. She mentioned something about coyotes and other wild animals, but I assured her I'd be fine. I had brought a sturdy tent, plenty of supplies, and even a pocket knife I thought made me look like I knew what I was doing. I picked a spot about half a mile from the house, near the edge of a forest that bordered the property. It was far enough to feel secluded, but close enough that I could see the faint glow of Grandma's porch light at night. The first evening, I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and built a small fire. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the sounds of crickets filled the night. It was perfect. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I spent my days helping Grandma with chores, feeding the chickens, weeding her garden, and mending fences, and my evenings enjoying the solitude of my campsite. The forest nearby seemed alive, but not in a threatening way. I'd hear rustling leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl, but it all felt normal, peaceful even. On the 3rd night, things started to change. I had just finished dinner, a can of beans heated over the fire, and was leaning back against a log, staring up at the stars. The night was darker than usual, with thick clouds blocking most of the moonlight. The crickets were quieter too, almost like something had disturbed them. I told myself it was nothing and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like something moving through the grass. My first thought was a raccoon or maybe a stray dog. I stayed still, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I didn't see anything. The fire had burned down to embers, casting an eerie glow around the campsite. I stayed there, holding my breath, scanning the area. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, and the night seemed to return to normal. I told myself it was probably just a deer and tried to go back to sleep, but my nerves kept me awake for hours. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Around the campsite, in the soft dirt, were footprints. They weren't from a deer or any animal I could think of. They were human, barefoot with long strides, circling my tent. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here walking around in the middle of the night? And why? I decided not to tell Grandma. She was already worried about me camping, and I didn't want her to think I couldn't handle it. Instead, I brushed it off as a prank or maybe even my imagination. I spent the day close to the house, helping her bake pies and fix a leaky faucet. By the time evening came, I was starting to feel better, like maybe I had overreacted. That night, I built a bigger fire, hoping it would keep animals or whoever it was away. I sat close to it, watching the flames dance, until my eyes grew heavy. I crawled into the tent, leaving the fire burning outside, and tried to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. It was the feeling of being watched. My skin prickled, and my chest tightened. I lay there, frozen, listening to the silence. Then, faintly, I heard it, breathing, slow and steady, just outside the tent. I didn't dare move. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it an animal? Person? Why were they so close? The breathing grew louder, and then I heard something scrape against the fabric of the tent, like fingers trailing along the surface. My hands shook as I reached for the pocket knife under my pillow. I held it tightly, waiting, my heart hammering in my chest. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, without warning, the tent shook violently, as if someone or something had grabbed it. I screamed, slashing at the tent with the knife, and scrambled out into the night. The fire had died down, but there was just enough light to see my surroundings. No one was there. The campsite was empty, but the air felt heavy, like something was still watching me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the house, leaving my tent and everything else behind. When I reached Grandma's porch, I turned back, half expecting to see someone chasing me. But the darkness was still, quiet. I burst into the house, locking the door behind me, and spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, staring out the window. The next morning, I went back to the campsite with Grandma. She was upset when I told her what happened, but she didn't seem surprised. As we approached the tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tent was slashed, not just from my knife, but from the outside as well. Long, jagged tears ran across the fabric, like someone had been trying to get in. Around the campsite, the same barefoot footprints were everywhere, leading into the forest. We packed up what was left of my gear and didn't say much on the walk back to the house. Grandma didn't ask me to explain, and I didn't offer any theories. But as we reached the porch, she put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Some things, it's best not to question." I never camped at Grandma's farm again. Whatever or whoever it was that came to my tent that night, I didn't want to meet them again. It was the summer of 2016, and I was 26 years old. I needed a break from my daily grind, so I decided to go camping alone. I had always been a fan of nature, quiet mornings, starry nights, and the stillness that the wilderness offered. I chose a spot in the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere remote but not completely off the map. It was a 3-hour drive from my home in North Carolina, a stretch of woods I'd heard about from some outdoorsy friends. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of water, freeze-dried meals, flashlight, batteries, a knife, first aid kit, and a map. I didn't want to rely on my phone since there likely wouldn't be service out there. The idea of disconnecting from everything for a weekend sounded perfect. I reached the trailhead by mid-morning. The parking lot was nearly empty except for 2 other cars. The trail itself was well-marked but quiet. I passed a few hikers coming down, exchanging nods and polite smiles. The hike to my chosen campsite was about 5 miles in, through dense forest with occasional clearings that offered breathtaking views of the rolling mountains. By the time I reached the site, the sun was high in the sky. It was a flat area near a small creek, surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The creek's gentle bubbling was the only sound besides the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I set up my tent on a patch of soft ground, making sure it was secure and positioned away from any potential hazards like falling branches or water runoff. After setting up camp, I took a quick walk around the area to familiarize myself. There was no sign of anyone nearby, no footprints, no discarded trash, nothing. It was perfect. The first evening was exactly what I had hoped for. I cooked a simple meal over my portable stove, sat back in my camping chair, and watched as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. As darkness fell, I lit a small campfire and leaned back to watch the stars. Out here, away from the city lights, the sky was alive with constellations. I crawled into my tent around 10 p.m., feeling at ease. The sound of the creek was soothing, and the cool night air was refreshing. I fell asleep quickly, the kind of deep sleep that only comes when you're far from the noise of everyday life. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore the area a bit more. I followed the creek upstream for about a mile, taking in the lush greenery and the occasional chirp of birds. The forest felt alive but not threatening. On my way back to camp, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A small pile of stones stacked neatly on top of each other near the edge of the creek. It was odd but not alarming. Maybe another camper had been here recently, though I hadn't seen or heard anyone. I shrugged it off and continued back to camp. By the time I got back, it was almost noon. I spent the rest of the day relaxing, reading a book I'd brought, and enjoying the solitude. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I couldn't shake a subtle feeling of unease. The forest seemed quieter than before, the shadows longer and darker. That night, I decided to skip the campfire and turn in early. I felt strangely exposed sitting outside in the open, even though I hadn't seen or heard anyone. I zipped myself into my tent and tried to relax, telling myself it was just my imagination. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. I lay still, listening. The creek was still bubbling, but there was something else. A faint rustling sound, like footsteps on leaves. It was slow and deliberate, not the random noise of an animal. My heart started to race. I reached for my flashlight and knife, keeping them close. The sound moved closer, circling the perimeter of my campsite. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't making any attempt to be quiet. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, as the sound eventually faded into the distance. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I cautiously unzipped my tent and stepped out. Everything seemed normal. Nothing was missing, and there were no obvious signs of disturbance. But then I noticed the same pile of stones I'd seen by the creek, now stacked neatly just a few feet from my tent. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't random. Someone had been here watching me. I decided to pack up and leave. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. About halfway back, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Hanging from a low branch along the trail was a small, crude figure made of sticks and twine, like something out of a horror movie. It hadn't been there on my way in. I didn't stop to examine it, quicken my pace, my heart pounding. I just wanted to get back to my car and leave. When I finally reached the parking lot, it was empty. My car was the only one there, just as I'd left it. I threw my gear into the back and started the engine, eager to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. As I pulled out onto the dirt road, I glanced in my rearview mirror and froze. Standing at the edge of the lot, partially hidden by the trees, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but they were watching me, completely still. I didn't wait to see if they would move. I hit the gas and didn't look back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me. I've told myself it was probably just another camper messing around, but deep down, I don't believe that. I've never gone camping alone again, and I probably never will. Whatever happened out there, I learned one thing for sure. The wilderness isn't always as empty as it seems. My sister, Claire, and I had been planning this trip for months. She was a scientist, always fascinated by the untouched wilderness, the rare species hidden in plain sight, and the ecosystem's intricate balance. I was just along for the ride, eager to escape the monotony of city life. It was late September 2018, and the crisp autumn air promised cool days and colder nights. We had picked the Rockies, a remote spot deep in Colorado, miles away from any trace of civilization. Claire said she wanted to collect soil and water samples for a research project. I didn't mind. I just wanted to breathe fresh air, take in the views, and enjoy the kind of quiet you can't find anywhere else. The drive up was uneventful. We parked the SUV at the base of a trailhead that looked more like a suggestion than a path. The forest was thick, and the trees towered over us, their leaves turning shades of gold, orange, and red. We loaded our packs, mine full of camping gear and hers filled with scientific equipment, and set off. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful. The air smelled of pine, and the forest was alive with the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Claire kept stopping to take notes or snap pictures. I didn't rush her. This was her trip, after all. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, we had reached a small clearing near a creek. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. We pitched the tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. Claire spent an hour analyzing water samples by the fire while I cooked a simple meal. The stars were out in full force, brighter than I'd ever seen, and the temperature dropped quickly as the night wore on. It was around midnight when I first felt uneasy. I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, or the unsettling silence that had replaced the usual nighttime forest sounds. I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, Claire was up before me, already knee-deep in her work. She had wandered a little farther upstream, collecting more samples and taking notes. I decided to explore the area around our camp. The forest was dense, and the undergrowth was thick, but I found a narrow trail that seemed well-worn. It led to a rocky outcrop overlooking a valley. The view was breathtaking, but something about the scene unsettled me. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like I was being watched. When I returned to camp, Claire was back, excited about her findings. She said the soil in this area was different, almost unnatural, but she couldn't explain it without further analysis. I didn't pay much attention to her excitement. I was too focused on the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. The second night was colder, and the wind howled through the trees. I kept waking up to unfamiliar sounds. A crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, something moving just beyond the edge of our campsite. Every time I looked, there was nothing there. Claire, of course, was unfazed. On the third day, we decided to hike farther into the wilderness. Claire wanted to reach a specific point she had marked on her map, a place she believed would yield even more interesting samples. The terrain grew steeper, and the forest became darker, the trees so close together they blocked out the sunlight. By late afternoon, we found another clearing and decided to set up camp. This spot felt different. The air was heavier, and the usual forest sounds were absent. Claire, as usual, was oblivious, focused on her work. I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be here. That night, the unease turned to dread. The sounds I had heard before were louder, closer. Something was moving around our campsite, just beyond the firelight. I lay in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, straining to hear over the wind. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up to Claire shaking me. It was still dark, but she looked terrified. She whispered that someone, or something, had been outside the tent. She had heard it breathing low and heavy. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing, but the ground outside was disturbed. The dirt scuffed and the grass trampled. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, we packed up and decided to head back to the car. Claire was shaken but tried to hide it, insisting that it was probably a deer or some other animal. I wasn't so sure. The hike back was grueling. The air felt heavier with every step, and the forest seemed darker than it had been before. About halfway to the car, we came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a campsite, or what was left of one. The tent was shredded, the fabric hanging in tatters from the trees. Gear was scattered everywhere, some of it broken, some of it just wrong. There was no sign of people, no explanation for what had happened. Claire wanted to investigate, but I convinced her to keep moving. Whatever had done this, I didn't want to meet it. The rest of the hike was a blur. The uneasy feeling never left, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the scratches. Deep, jagged marks ran along the driver's side door, as if something with claws had tried to get inside. We didn't speak as we loaded our gear and started the engine. The drive back to civilization was tense, both of us too scared to say what we were thinking. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't an animal, at least not one I'd ever heard of. When we got home, Claire analyzed her samples. She said the soil and water contained traces of heavy metals not usually found in that area, as if the land itself had been poisoned. She tried to go back to the Rockies a month later, but I refused to join her. I still think about that trip, about the sounds, the shredded tent, the scratches on the car. I'll never know what was out there, but I do know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be explored.